Some wounds don't bleed on the outside. They sit quietly inside a person for years, sometimes decades, and no one ever knows. Marcus Williams was 29 years old, and his whole life had been shaped by one question he never got to ask. Where is my father? He hadn't grown up angry about it. His grandmother, Miss Evelyn, had made sure of that. She raised him in a small house in Memphis, Tennessee, with 3 rules: say your prayers, do your homework, and never let your hurt turn into hate. Marcus had followed all 3. But that didn't mean the hurt wasn't there. When Family Feud called and offered his family a spot on the show, Marcus's aunt told him to wear something nice. His grandmother told him to smile. Neither of them could have imagined what would happen that Tuesday afternoon in a television studio in Atlanta, or that Steve Harvey, a man who had seen everything, would be the one to witness a moment that had been 30 years in the making. If you've ever grown up missing someone you never got to know, this one is for you. Stay with us. Because what happened next proves that sometimes life gives you back exactly what it took. Marcus Williams was 29 years old, born and raised in the South Memphis neighborhood of Tennessee. He worked as a high school counselor at the same school he once attended as a quiet, bookish kid who kept mostly to himself. His students loved him because he understood them, the ones who came in every Monday morning carrying weight that had nothing to do with homework. He understood them because he had been one of them. His mother, Diane, had gotten pregnant at 19. She was bright and determined, but the man she loved, a man named Robert, had walked out before Marcus was even born. There was no custody battle, no legal dispute. Robert simply disappeared, and Diane was left to hold a newborn baby alone in a 1-bedroom apartment. She tried her best. But when Marcus was 4 years old, Diane got sick, a long, slow illness that eventually took her when Marcus was just 7 years old. From that moment, it was Marcus and his grandmother, Miss Evelyn Williams, against the world. Miss Evelyn was 73 now. She still wore her church hat on Sundays, still made biscuits from scratch on Saturday mornings, and still called Marcus baby, even though he towered over her at 6'2". She had never once spoken badly about Robert in front of Marcus. Not once. When Marcus got old enough to ask questions, she had simply said, "Some people aren't ready for what God gives them. That's their loss and our gain." Marcus had never searched for his father. It wasn't pride and it wasn't indifference. He simply couldn't afford to want something that might not want him back. He had his grandmother. He had his students. He had the life Miss Evelyn had built for him with steady hands and an unbreakable spirit. That was enough, or so he told himself. What nobody knew, not his aunt, not his coworkers, not even his closest friends, was that Marcus had found his father 3 months earlier. He hadn't gone looking. It happened by accident, through an old photograph in a box his grandmother was cleaning out. Marcus recognized the eyes immediately. They were his eyes. He'd found the name on the photo's back, Robert James Williams, searched online, and found a phone number in Atlanta. He had stared at that number for 3 weeks before putting his phone down and never dialing. He wasn't ready, but life, it seems, had its own timeline. The Family Feud taping was supposed to be a birthday surprise for Miss Evelyn. Marcus's aunt, Patricia, had submitted an application 8 months earlier, and somehow they had been selected. The whole family treated it like a celebration. Miss Evelyn dressed up. Marcus wore a blazer. His cousins, Dion and Jasmine, were loud and joyful and completely at ease in the bright lights of the studio. Marcus was not at ease. He told himself it was just nerves. The cameras, the audience, the energy of a live taping, it was a lot for someone who spent his days in quiet school corridors and counseling offices. But the truth was something else. 3 days before the taping, his grandmother had pulled out that same box of photographs while the family gathered for Sunday dinner. She had shown them around the table as a kind of memory-sharing exercise. This is where we came from, this is who loved you. And that's when Jasmine had picked up the photo with Robert's face and said, out loud in front of everyone, "Who is this man? He looks just like Marcus." The table had gone quiet. Miss Evelyn had looked at Marcus carefully. Marcus had said nothing. He had simply taken the photograph, folded it into his jacket pocket, and excused himself to get more sweet tea from the kitchen. Nobody brought it up again. But Marcus had carried that photograph to Atlanta in his pocket. Why, he couldn't fully explain. Maybe because it was the closest thing he had to a piece of his father. Maybe because he needed something to hold on to. On stage, when Steve Harvey greeted the Williams family, Marcus noticed his grandmother's face light up the way it only did in church and on Marcus's birthday. She was so happy. That happiness was real and big, and it made Marcus want to be fully present, to let go of the quiet grief that had followed him like a shadow since childhood. The Williams family played well in the main game. Miss Evelyn got 3 answers right in a row during one round, and the audience went wild. Marcus smiled wider than he had in months. For a few minutes, it was just joy, pure, uncomplicated joy. Then it was time for fast money, and Marcus volunteered to go first. He stood at the podium and the studio lights felt different up close. Warmer, more pressing. Steve Harvey gave him the usual prep speech and Marcus nodded along. But then Steve paused. He tilted his head slightly the way he sometimes did when he sensed something beneath the surface of a contestant. "You all right, brother?" Steve asked quietly before the clock started, not performing, genuinely asking. Marcus looked at him. For a second, he almost said it. He almost told the whole story right there before a single question was asked. Instead, he just said, "I'm good, I'm here for my grandmother." Steve held his gaze for one more moment. "All right," he said, "let's play." Marcus answered 4 of the 5 questions in the top 2 answers. His cousin Dion went second, and together they crossed the threshold. The Williams family had won. The studio erupted. Miss Evelyn cried. Jasmine grabbed Patricia, and they were jumping in place. Dion ran across the stage to embrace Marcus in a bear hug. And Marcus stood there, tears on his face, but not entirely from the win. Because at that exact moment in the celebration, the photograph had slipped out of his jacket pocket and fallen to the floor of the stage. Steve Harvey saw it fall. He bent down and picked it up. He looked at the photograph, a young man, maybe 20 years old, with Marcus's eyes and jawline and cheekbones, and then looked up at Marcus. "Who is this?" Steve asked quietly, the microphone down by his side. Marcus took a breath. "That's my father," he said. "I've never met him." The audience had not heard this. The celebration was still happening around them, but Steve Harvey had gone completely still. What happened next, even the producers did not fully anticipate. Steve Harvey gently raised his hand and the room gradually settled. The audience sensed a shift. The energy changed the way it changes before a storm or before something sacred. "Hold on," Steve said into the microphone. "Hold on, I need a moment with this family." He turned to Marcus and spoke plainly, not theatrically, the way a man speaks when something has genuinely moved him past performance. "Brother, can I ask you something? On television, you don't have to answer." Marcus looked at his grandmother. Miss Evelyn gave him the slightest nod, the same small nod she had given him before his first day of high school, before his college graduation, before every hard thing she had quietly helped him walk through. "Yeah," Marcus said, "you can ask. Tell me about this photograph." And Marcus told it, not dramatically, not with the practiced rhythm of a man who had rehearsed the story. He told it the way you tell something you've carried alone for too long, carefully, quietly, in plain words. His father had left before he was born. His mother had died when he was 7. His grandmother had raised him. He had found his father by accident 3 months ago through this photograph. He had a name, he had a phone number, he had stared at it for 3 weeks and never called. "Why not?" Steve asked. The studio was so quiet you could hear the ventilation. "Because what if he didn't want to be found?" Marcus said. Steve Harvey did not respond immediately. He looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then he looked at Miss Evelyn, who was pressing a tissue to the corner of her eye. Then he looked back at Marcus. "You know what you just did?" Steve said. "You came to this show for your grandmother. You played for her. You put her happiness in front of your own pain. That's what a man does. That is what a man does." The audience applauded, but Steve was not finished. "I want to tell you something from personal experience." He took a step closer to Marcus. "I know what it is to wonder about a parent. I know what it is to carry that question. And I will tell you this, the wondering does more damage than the answer. Whatever that answer is, you can handle it, because look at who you became without him." Miss Evelyn had stood up from her seat. Nobody told her to. She simply stood the way she stood in church when the Spirit moved, and Marcus turned to look at her. "Baby," she said, her voice full and steady, "you've been holding that for too long. It's time to put it down." Steve Harvey made a decision in that moment, a real one, not a scripted beat. "I have a question for the producers," he said. He turned toward the back of the studio. "Is there any chance at all, that we can find out if Robert Williams is in Atlanta?" What the audience did not know was that Marcus had, in a moment of vulnerability weeks earlier, mentioned his father's name and city to a family friend who happened to be connected to someone at the show's production company. It was a long chain of coincidence, or something more than coincidence. The producers had quietly done some research. They had found Robert Williams, 61 years old, living in the Decatur neighborhood of Atlanta, less than 40 minutes from the studio. They had reached out to him the previous week, not guaranteeing anything, simply asking. Robert had said yes. A producer in the wings gave a small, discreet nod to Steve Harvey. Steve turned back to Marcus. "What if I told you," Steve said slowly, "that your father is here right now in this building?" Marcus did not move. He didn't cry out. He didn't collapse. He simply stood very still, the way a person stands when something they've stopped believing in suddenly becomes real. "Is that?" Marcus started, then stopped. "He's here," Steve said. "He came, and before he comes out, I want you to know something. He reached out to us first, Marcus. We didn't go looking for him. When someone told him there was a chance to see you, he didn't wait. He said yes." From the side entrance of the studio, a man walked out. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cut gray hair and eyes, Marcus's eyes, that were already wet before he reached center stage. Robert Williams stopped about 10 feet away from his son. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, the way a person looks at something they've been afraid to face for 30 years. "I don't know if you want to hear anything from me," Robert said. His voice was rough with emotion. "I know I don't deserve this. I know I lost the right to stand in front of you a long time ago, but I've been watching you from a distance for years. I know you're a counselor. I know you help kids who come from where you came from. I know your grandmother raised you right." He paused. "I was a coward. I was 20 years old and I was afraid, and I made the worst decision of my life. I have thought about you every day, every single day." The studio was completely silent. Marcus looked at his grandmother. She nodded once more. Then Marcus took 3 steps forward, closed the distance between himself and his father, and extended his hand. It was a handshake, firm, deliberate, a grown man's gesture. Not a hug, not yet. A beginning. Steve Harvey stood to the side, and for perhaps the first time in years of hosting, he said absolutely nothing. He simply watched. When Marcus extended that hand, Steve put his own fist to his chest and looked away for a moment to collect himself. Then he turned back to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve said, his voice quieter than usual, "we came here today to play a game, but what we just witnessed, that is what this show is actually about. That handshake right there. That man extending grace to someone who didn't earn it because his grandmother raised him to be bigger than his pain. That's not a game show moment. That's a life moment." The episode aired 6 weeks later. Within 24 hours, the clip of Marcus and Robert's handshake had been viewed over 12 million times. The comments were not what internet comments usually are. They were long, personal, and full of stories that began the same way. "I never knew my father either, and I've been holding the same photograph for years." Thousands of people wrote in. Veterans who had been estranged from their children. Adult children who had never found the courage to reach out. Parents who had walked away from something fragile and young and spent decades regretting it. The clip became a kind of permission, a signal that it was possible to reach across a 30-year gap and not be destroyed by what you found on the other side. For Marcus and Robert, the relationship that followed the handshake was not immediate and seamless. Neither of them pretended otherwise. Robert was a stranger, and Marcus was careful with his heart the way anyone is careful with something that has been hurt before. They started slowly, phone calls, then a lunch, then a Saturday afternoon at the restaurant where Robert had worked for 15 years as a line cook, moving up over the decades to head chef. Marcus sat at the counter and Robert cooked for him. They talked about small things first: music, Memphis versus Atlanta, sports, and then gradually harder things. Robert explained what had driven him away at 20. It wasn't a satisfying explanation, there isn't one for abandonment, and Marcus knew that, but it was an honest one. Fear, immaturity, the specific cowardice of a young man who did not yet know how to be anything. Robert had rebuilt himself. He had stopped drinking at 35. He had worked steadily, paid his bills, stayed clean. He had tried twice to reach out to Diane's family years earlier and been turned away both times. After that, he had carried the loss in silence. Marcus listened to all of it. He asked his questions. He did not excuse the hurt, but he also did not refuse the relationship. "I'm a counselor," he told Robert during one of those early conversations. "I know what it costs to stay angry. I don't want to pay that price anymore." Miss Evelyn met Robert 6 months after the taping. Marcus drove him to Memphis, and they all sat at Miss Evelyn's kitchen table and ate biscuits from scratch. Robert thanked her with his eyes full of everything a person carries when they face the person who did the raising they should have done. Miss Evelyn poured him more coffee, looked at him steadily, and said, "You being here now is what matters. The rest is between you and God." That was all she said about it, and it was enough. Steve Harvey followed up with Marcus 6 months after the episode aired, as he sometimes did with contestants whose stories had stayed with him. Marcus told him that he and Robert had been to a Memphis Grizzlies game together, that Robert had started calling once a week, that it was strange and careful and sometimes uncomfortable and also, slowly in small ways, good. "How do you feel?" Steve asked. "Like I put something down that I'd been carrying so long I forgot I was carrying it," Marcus said. Steve included that quote in a speech he gave later that year at a charity event focused on fatherlessness in America. He told Marcus's story with his permission and ended the speech by saying, "Healing doesn't always look like what you imagined. Sometimes it looks like a handshake. Sometimes it starts with just showing up." The national conversation that followed Marcus's episode was substantial. Child welfare organizations and family reunification nonprofits reported sharp increases in inquiries. A grief counselor who specialized in father absence issues wrote an article describing the episode as culturally significant. not because it solved the problem, but because it named it on television without shame. Marcus was invited to speak at several conferences for school counselors. He always said the same thing. The most important work he did wasn't academic advising. It was sitting with students who came in carrying something invisible and making sure they knew they were seen. "I do that work," he would say, "because someone did it for me, my grandmother, and then unexpectedly a man on a game show who stopped the celebration for a minute and asked if I was really okay." 1 year after the episode aired, the Williams family returned to Family Feud for a special segment. Robert sat in the audience for the first time, not on stage, not yet, just present. Marcus glanced at him once during the taping and gave a small nod. Robert nodded back. It was not a healed relationship. It was a healing one. And that, Marcus told the camera during his interview segment, was the difference he had learned to hold on to. "Healed means it's finished," he said. "Healing means you're still in it. I'm still in it. That's the better thing." Miss Evelyn, watching from her chair in the front row with her church hat in her steady hands, smiled the way she always smiled when Marcus said something that proved she had done her job. The photograph, the one that had started everything, now sits framed on a shelf in Marcus's counseling office at the high school in Memphis. Some of his students have asked about it. When they do, he tells them the truth, that it's a picture of his father, that he grew up without him, and that the ending isn't always what you expect, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. He tells them to be patient with the story. He tells them that sometimes the most important moments come when you least expect them, in the middle of a game show, in a television studio in Atlanta, when a photograph falls out of your pocket and lands on the floor at the feet of a man who knows when to stop and ask the right question. He tells them that healing is possible, not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. And some days, that is the only thing that matters. If this story moved you, hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.